Today we're going to talk about crema, that beautiful red-brown foam that sits on top of any well-made espresso. We're going to talk about what it is, why it exists, is it good, is it bad, should you skip it off, should you leave it on? All of this and more we shall answer in today's video. So let's start with the name, because the name is initially kind of confusing. Crema comes from the Italian for cream, but this is a foam, this isn't cream. Why did it get its name? It goes back to 1948 to 1950. Achille Gaggia has got this new espresso machine. It's brewing at much higher pressures than anyone has brewed with before, and the espresso coming out of his machine has this weird foam on top. And initially people are like, what's wrong with the scummy foam on top of your coffee? And he turns a negative into a positive. He starts to advertise his machines as having crema caffè naturale, natural cream coffee, or natural coffee cream. I don't know. This is a wonderful stroke of branding genius in my eyes. He names one of the great things about espresso and further cements his reputation or place in history as a father of espresso. So the name sticks. At no point do we really ever argue it, and at some point that Italian word becomes an English word to represent the foam on an espresso. So why does it happen? Why is it unique to espresso? What's going on here? Crema begins in the roasting process. When you roast coffee, you generate CO2. It's a kind of byproduct of some of the reactions that go on inside the coffee bean as it goes brown. Things like the Maillard reaction or the Strecker degradation, they produce CO2 as a byproduct. That CO2 is trapped inside the coffee bean, and if your coffee bean is fresh, there'll still be lots and lots inside it when you come to put it in your grinder to make yourself some coffee. So you grind your espresso, nice and fine, you tamp it down, put it in and you brew it. That hot water comes into your brewing chamber and hits that coffee. Now, one of the properties of water is that the higher the pressure that water is under, the more CO2 that it can dissolve. So that's what's kind of happening here. As the water's passing through those grounds at 9 bars of pressure, any CO2 that's in them that is available is getting dissolved into the water. Essentially, you're kind of force carbonating your brewing liquid at this point using the CO2 in the ground coffee. The moment, however, that the coffee leaves the basket and it goes from being in a pressurized environment to an atmospheric environment, right? There's no more pressure on the coffee anymore. Well, the water has become super saturated with the CO2 and it can't keep hold of it anymore. It can't keep it dissolved, and so it comes out of solution as a bubble. I'll give you a brief visual explanation of this one to hopefully make a bit more sense. We're going to need two things here. This, not particularly full bottle of espresso. This is old espresso, it's brewed a little while ago. It's got no crema on it whatsoever, but it is espresso. And what I'm going to do is carbonate it. I'm going to sort of mimic the espresso brewing process. From that perspective, I'm going to force carbonation into the liquid. And it'll be done so at high pressure. And when we get rid of that pressure, well, something interesting should happen. So to force carbonate, I obviously need a tank of CO2, like this one. So I'm going to use this. I'm going to just push some air out of here because air inhibits carbonation. And then, so it might not look like it, but the excess CO2 is dissolved now into the coffee below, just like when you're brewing espresso. And so when I release the pressure, and look, just like on any soft drink that you might expect, a layer of foam has formed. Now with espresso, the carbonation is kind of different. It's not as intense as it would be in a soft drink. You wouldn't get as bigger, coarser bubbles coming out of solution as you would do in espresso. The foam in espresso is much finer, but the principle is really the same. Which begs the question, why does coffee foam? In order to explain this very quickly, we need to talk about why things foam in the first place. Generally speaking, a foam is a bunch of air bubbles trapped in a liquid, and something in that liquid is called a surfactant, a surface active agent. It's something that wraps itself around a bubble of air and it makes that bubble strong. Now, the reason it wraps itself around a bubble of air, more often than not, is that part of that thing really hates water, while the rest of it quite likes water. So it's desperate, it's sort of repelled by water, it's desperate to find anything that isn't water. A gas bubble is a wonderful thing, because all the bits that hate water can face the gas, all the bits that like water can face the water. Now, in espresso, there are a lot of different compounds that are surfactants. In fact, caffeine at a high enough concentration will act as a surfactant, but it isn't really playing a role here. There's been a lot of research done on this, and broadly speaking, they think the active surfactants in espresso are probably things like melanoidins, protein-derived roasting byproducts. There are other things in coffee that do play a role in foaming, but they may not be the primary drivers of foaming. And so that's how we get crema. We've got our espresso, you dissolve in the melanoidins, some other compounds too. CO2 gets dissolved in as well, leaves the basket, CO2 can't stay in solution, appears as a bubble inside the espresso, and then gets trapped, wrapped up in all these lovely surfactants and made strong as a foam. But somehow, crema retains more of a mystique than, say, the head on a pint of beer. But they're basically the same thing. They've happened for the same reasons. But what is it about crema that just gets people so excited? Now, firstly, it might be the colour. Crema looks stunning. Now, the colour is tied to a couple of things. It's primarily tied to the colour of the liquid down below. Now, espresso looks like it's just one very dark brown colour, but it's not. A less extracted or a weaker espresso will produce a less brown foam. Stands to reason. But it isn't just concentration, because roast level also plays a role here. The darker you roast coffee, the darker the colour of that liquid is going to be, and therefore the darker the foam is going to be. In addition, the darker that you roast coffee, the more CO2 that you produce. And it isn't just roast. Traditionally in Italy, Robusta plays a role in many espresso blends. Now, leaving aside the debate of whether we should call it Robusta or Caffea Canefera, we'll come back to that another time maybe, the presence of Robusta has been kind of desirable to many Italian roasters for a long time, not just because it's cheap, not just because it has low acidity and high body, but because it gives you more crema. In fact, studies suggest that Robusta typically has about twice the CO2 content after roasting than Arabica, which is super interesting. But it comes with one more twist. Robusta typically has less oil, less lipids, less fats in it than Arabica. Now, you might have made meringue, and at some point you might have learnt that getting a little bit of egg yolk in your egg white is a no-go for foaming, because in that particular foam, the fat in the egg yolk provides an alternative to the air bubble for the proteins in the egg white, which means you have a much less stable foam, because there are choices in a way. You can go for the fat, you can go for the air. Same is true, kind of, in espresso. If you're brewing coffee with Arabica, chances are your emulsion, those little tiny droplets of oil that pressure have emulsified in the liquid below, well, those oil droplets are actually working against your crema. The higher the lipid content of the coffee, the less stable the foam is going to be, and that's been backed up by quite a lot of research. Now, people will talk about crema as if the emulsified oil in the crema is a really important part of it and what makes it good. Yes, there is emulsified oil in the crema, but only because there's emulsified oil in the espresso liquid, and the liquid made the foam. It's working against the crema's lifespan by being there. And as a side note, you might then wonder, if I paper filtered my espresso, if I got rid of the oils in my espresso, would I have longer lasting crema? It's a good question. We ran a little test. We pulled 2 shots side by side, one of which had been paper filtered using an AeroPress filter at the bottom of the basket. Both of them had nice crema. Both of the cremas lasted as long as you would want them to, and certainly longer than the sort of lifespan in which you would typically want to drink an espresso within. So not worth the extra step from that perspective. Now, one more little aspect that came up a few times in the papers, and this goes back to how espresso looks, is tiger flecking or tiger stripes or whatever you want to call that flecking that you'll often see on the top of an espresso. This is very common when you brew with a lot of different coffees. They're typically more of a kind of medium to medium dark or dark roasts. Very light roasts, you won't get as much flecking on there, because these flecks are little tiny pieces of coffee. They're just tiny particles of ground coffee that have made it through the basket that are stuck in the foam. These look beautiful. They look really good, both, in the cup and under a microscope too, actually. They look kind of interesting there as well. There is speculation in the scientific community that these tiny pieces of coffee actually help stabilize the foam. It's kind of an interesting idea. Having read a bunch of papers, I'm not necessarily sure I truly understand why that might be the case, and I'm not sure that I've seen that in the real world. Interestingly, they did note that Robusta doesn't really produce that much in terms of kind of tiger striping or flecking on top, which I just thought was an interesting little side note. Now, all of this leads us to what I think is the most important question, which is Crema good? Is it desirable? Is it helpful? Is it necessary? Before I answer that, I want to talk about two other quick things. Firstly, this video has an ad in it, and therefore it has a coffee giveaway. If you are out of work, you've been laid off, if you're struggling for money and you can't access great coffee, click the link in the description. There's a competition. I'll pick 10 people randomly anywhere in the world that I can send coffee, and I'll send them some coffee. If you can afford coffee right now, please continue supporting local businesses. They need you now more than ever. I do all this because, as I said, this video has a little ad in it. An ad for this video sponsor, which is Squarespace. If you need a website or a domain, then I would recommend using Squarespace. I've been using Squarespace for years now, and it has made building a website quick and easy. There's no steep learning curve here. There's no hours and hours and hours spent learning stuff just to get a simple, beautiful page on a website. Start by taking one of their templates, and then you very quickly customize it. It's your images, it's your words, it's your personality, and it's a great showcase for who you are and what you do online. It could be a blog, it could be a portfolio of photography. It could be an e-commerce store that you've started out of your bedroom. It could be a showcase for your cafe or your restaurant. Using Squarespace makes all of that quick and easy. There's nothing to patch, upgrade, or worry about. And if you have an issue, there's 24/7 email support. But just give it a try. Sign up at the link down below and build a website. And after 14 days when you're ready to launch, use code James Hoffmann for 10% off any website or domain. Thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. I will put a lot of links to different scientific papers up on my particular website. There'll be a link in the description to that particular page if you want to get deeper into the science. There's one particular paper I would recommend strongly as a starting point, and I'll put in a few little supplemental references that you might find interesting too. But let's talk about, is Crema good? And from a scientific perspective, it's interesting. It's not as clear-cut as you might think. Now, Crema is a great piece of feedback. It says you've probably brewed the espresso pretty well. It doesn't say if the coffee was good or bad, if it was well roasted or badly roasted, but it says you've brewed fresh coffee slow enough to produce a good, dense foam. You've done okay. Or you can think of it another way. If you brew a shot that doesn't have good crema, something has definitely gone wrong. But does it really enhance the sensory experience? And here it's interesting, because broadly speaking, the answer is kind of, but no. Now, years ago, I got myself in trouble with the internet for advocating skimming off the crema for an espresso. It wasn't even my idea. It had come from the coffee collective in Denmark who'd been doing it for Americanos. I did it with an espresso and was astounded by the difference that it made. Try it for yourself. Brew an espresso, get a couple teaspoons, and skim off a layer of crema. Stir and drink the shot, and you'll find a substantial reduction in the bitterness and kind of roasty quality of that espresso. It might also be lacking, and you might argue that it's more effort than it's worth, and life is fine. You can just stir and drink your espresso and you can have a nice time, and I won't argue with you there. But this has been backed up by proper research too. There was a paper published by Dr. Britta Fulmer and others, I think she talked about it in a RICO talk, that sort of said that varying the amount of crema essentially varied the presence of the roasted note, I think was their language, the kind of roastiness essentially of the coffee. More crema gave a more intense kind of a roasty quality to it. Now that paper did also talk about how sort of perception of very top level flighty aromatics varied with different levels of crema. Essentially they were more perceptible with more crema, but did also say that broadly speaking, from a sensory perspective, there were not strong differences in the taste profiles of the espresso based on how much foam they had, outside of this roasted note that really varied across all of them. For me, skimming espresso massively reduces the bitterness, and I think in part because all of those fine pieces of ground coffee that are trapped in the foam, well, they get whipped out and taken away and you don't have to taste them. If you've ever ended up with any amount of grounds in your mouth for whatever reason, you know that they're not a fun time. We taste with more than just our mouths and our noses. How things look has an impact, and a great looking crema does enhance the joy, the pleasure of espresso, even if it doesn't do it in a kind of objective way. I'd like to think crema plays a role in the kind of tactile aspect, but I'm not sure in a blindfold if I could tell the difference between one that had lots of crema and one that kind of didn't. The texture of espresso primarily comes from the concentration of the liquid, as well as the particular compounds that you've dissolved, which is kind of down to the coffee that you started with. Now, I did wonder if you could actually cheat and get more crema somehow. So I did try force carbonating coffee beans. Essentially, I put a bunch of coffee beans in a bottle, squeezed out as much air as I could, and then aggressively carbonated them. Didn't really seem to make any difference, even if I held it under pressure for a little while. So in case you're curious, I tried it for you. Not the biggest result. Such is life. So a quick summary. Arabica produces less crema than Robusta, but darker roasts produce more crema than lighter roasts. Fresher coffee will give you more crema. The colour of crema is about how dark the roast was to start with and how strong the espresso that you've made is. And that's kind of it. Crema is beautiful. But you don't need to chase it. You don't need to worry about it. Eking out a little bit more may not necessarily give you better tasting coffee. I'm interested to hear your thoughts though. What didn't we discuss? What should we have talked about that we didn't? Did you go down a rabbit hole of chasing as much crema as you possibly could and then find that things maybe don't taste as good as they could? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. But for now, I'll say thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day. Lots of you have been asking about the French press poster. It's now available. We worked with an incredible artist, Ashley Alanda Strandquist, and she's done a beautiful job. She even put me in here, which I kind of love. As well as a few of her friends, I think, which is kind of cool. So you can check that out now. It's available, link down in the description below. It's available for a limited time. Hope you like it.